were great. Great fullbacks and great rugby stories.
RWH Bob Scott. Great Scott.
Roy Roper sends the ball back to Scott. He not only sidesteps two Lions, but brings New Zealand back on attack at halfway, passing infield.
He was my hero in my early years.
DB Don Clarke, the boot.
Jackson kicks ahead, and with Lions charging at him, Don Clarke props and pots a magnificent left footer right between the posts.
As I thought he was, you know, tremendous as a fullback, forgetting about his ability as a goal kicker.
They were match winners. Clarke remembered for his kicking feats and Scott for kicking in bare feet. The tradition of great New Zealand fullbacks started with Billy Wallace, the fullback in our first full-scale international and the last surviving member of the great 1905 side. George Napier, born in 1905 and the most famous player in a most famous team, the 1924 Invincibles.
The Black Panther, they called him.
There was something of a Harry Houdini in his play.
At Twickenham against England, watch Napier at work. He's surrounded by Englishmen, but he eludes all his would-be tacklers and kicks.
Billy Wallace, George Napier, gone but not forgotten. Bob Scott and Don Clarke, All Blacks, fullbacks. It was a tradition carried on by John Gallagher before his switch to league.
Oh, look at that! Fingertip control from John Gallagher, and what a clearance!
The fullback's role is demanding. He's there to defend, to tackle and stop the opposition scoring.
Gallagher was what a good tackle.
Davis.
He must also defend with courage.
Well taken by John Gallagher.
That was a brave mark from John Gallagher.
Fullbacks give it as well as taking it, creating or finishing scoring opportunities.
Clarke frees it. Fox. Long ball to Stanley. And Gallagher is in under the post.
Television undoubtedly highlighted Gallagher's ability for the league scouts. Wallace, Napier, Scott and Clarke were judged in the main by the crowds in the stands and on the terraces. So who deserves the accolade, the best? Is it Don Clarke?
New Zealand attacking here. Here's the kick by Watt over towards the far side. Clarke racing through after. Clarke is going to the score for New Zealand. Don Clarke. Don Clarke a try for New Zealand.
Or is it Bob Scott of the cool head and sure hands? Two great fullbacks have agreed that one of these superb players is the greatest.
But Ireland couldn't pull the game out of the fire.
This is Freeman's Bay today, a pleasant inner-city Auckland suburb. It's a far cry from the mean streets of the Depression years, the streets where a young Bob Scott played barefooted and, having played, went to work on a milk round in the dead of night when just 13 years old. It was an upbringing as different from Don Clarke's as city is from country. The Scott children had spent time in Salvation Army orphanages when their parents' marriage failed. Bob then lived for a time with his father, a wounded Gallipoli veteran, here in Freeman's Bay. His father died when Bob was still in his early teens. Sport was one escape and war another. Scott survived that as well to become a member of the legendary Kiwis Army team. He vied with another great, Herb Cook, in that team until an injury to his rival left Scott as the first choice for All Black honours. Freeman's Bay borders on Ponsonby, and after the war, Scott, who had earlier played league, joined the famous Ponies. The club still remembers him, and Scott himself remembers the earlier difficult days and the effect they had on him.
I think I slightly suffered with an inferiority complex, which made a sort of an attitude that if I come under pressure, I'd hit out rather than, you know, sort of be polite about things. But at the same time, the background of the life, I think it obviously developed a certain amount of character in myself to fight it out, sort of thing.
By contrast, Don, brothers Graham, Brian, Doug and fellow All Black Ian were country lads, encouraged in their sport by totally supportive parents. All played for Waikato, all 5 turning out in one match, a third of the team. Waikato is Mulu country, and it was on the paddocks of the family farm that the 5 Clarke boys played and practiced. Don would concentrate on kicking, experimenting for hour after hour to perfect the technique that was to make him a goal-kicking colossus on rugby fields all around the world. This giant of the game was too big to play rugby for his primary school and instead played netball with the girls. But he could play club rugby, and when he was only 11 years old was playing in the under-18 grade.
It was very tough, but if I wanted to play rugby, and of course rugby coming from my home background and our national sport, I wanted to play rugby as much as I could.
Bob Scott rose above his less than happy childhood to become one of the game's all-time greats, hero worshipped.
Don Clarke starts his run over the halfway line.
Don Clarke's love of rugby endured the physical knocks he took as a youngster.
It hits the crossbar and
He challenged Scott in public esteem. Clarke and Scott, 2 rugby legends whose playing days brought good times and bad. Robert William Henry Scott. He could surely kick. A Scott penalty or conversion was often the match decider.
Yes, it's there. Bob Scott, who could kick across Cook Strait and still get it between the posts, made no doubt about those extra 2 points.
A further mark of his genius was his positional play.
There goes Scott again, always in the right spot at the right time.
He was tenacious on defence, a deadly tackler.
Scott the Superb, the papers called him, stopped a breakthrough only yards from his line. As usual, he was the star of the day.
But most of all, it was Scott's poise under pressure, his elusiveness, that for many fans made him not just the greatest fullback, but the greatest player. A hard man to put down if you could catch him. His ability to evade the charge of would-be tacklers had an unusual inspiration.
Anytime I ever saw film of bullfighters and their ability to just move that little tiny bit, and it was quite obvious it was only just in the movement of the body and the balance, because you virtually hardly even have to move your feet to beat people. The fact was that I did have that ability to make that slightest of moves, to put people off balance. Put it another way, to do things with my hand in relationship to my brain, my hands and my feet. And I think I have that to, I'm sure you'll forgive me, don't think I'm full of myself, but I feel I had that to an exceptional degree.
So did the selectors, who persuaded Scott to come out of retirement to tour with Bob Stewart's All Blacks to Britain and France.
To wish the All Blacks every success, the whole town turned out, plus a full pipe band to head their procession through the streets. The team were to travel by flying boat on the first stage of their journey to the mother country.
It was an historic occasion, the first team to travel to the Northern Hemisphere by air rather than with a long sea journey.
Soon, London was below. Their journey was almost ended. Swiftly, safely, in great comfort, they had crossed the world.
Judged on matches played and won or lost, it wasn't a great team. But in game after game, Bob Scott, now well into his 30s, showed all the old skills were still there. His last match in Britain was against the Barbarians.
A grand long-range kick went over the bar. There was plenty of good, crisp passing by the tourist three-quarters. Helping the attack, Scott received and cut through the defence like a knife. As he fell, he slipped the ball to Jardine, who dived over for a try. 19-5 was how it ended. Another resounding victory to add to the All Blacks list. Both teams linked hands in the centre of the pitch for Auld Lang Syne. A happy sporting gesture that made perhaps the most moving scene ever to take place on a rugby pitch.
It was quite an emotional sort of a game. It was the last game of the tour. It was obviously more or less my last major game in you know, the All Blacks. I suppose Cardiff Arms and the Barbarian game would be the one.
As Scott's career was drawing to an end, a young fullback who'd been unsuccessful in the trials to pick this team was assessing his chances of succeeding great Scott.
Bob Scott, a great rugby player, and it wasn't until till I'd sort of gone halfway through my rugby career that I actually met Bob Scott. And he is the same quality of a guy as he was as a rugby player. Super guy, and I tried to emulate many things that Bob did.
Donald Barry Clarke. If Scott impressed with the subtlety of his play, Don Clarke, the next fullback to rival him for the sheer impact he made, did so with power and strength.
The crowds that throng the playing fields of New Zealand know and love their rugby union football. They support a club, favour their representative team, and argue the merits of All Blacks, past and present. Some days they watch greatness emerge. Rugby Park, Hamilton, June 9th, 1956. The South Africans are playing their first match in New Zealand against Waikato. From Reed's pass, over in the corner goes McDonald. Now, from the ranks of country players, appears a young goal-kicking fullback, Don Clarke, who helps pile up winning points for Waikato against the Springboks.
That performance led to Clarke being selected for the third test against the Springboks in 1956. The alarm bells had sounded after the Springboks won the second test and tied the series. It was August the 18th, Lancaster Park.
August the 18th, 1956, to me was the start of an international career that I didn't want to throw away. I want to nurture, I want to keep that as something special in my life. Within 6 minutes or 7 minutes of the start of the game, I had that first shot at goal. I was very nervous. Not nervous about kicking, because if I did everything right, there was no reason why it shouldn't go over. My parents said prayers, and I said prayers, and, you know, from there, really, it was a start of a fabulous 9 years of international rugby.
That fabulous 9 years of international rugby included winning the series against the Springboks in 56, a record number of points in Australia in 57, and who could forget this test against the Lions in 59, and a world record 6 penalty goals.
They had more penalty shots at goal that day than New Zealand did. I was successful, their kicker was unsuccessful.
2 minutes to go. Among the crowd, there's almost regret that Don Clarke's great boot will spell defeat for the British Isles. Yes, it's a goal. Clarke has kicked 18 points for New Zealand against the British Isles 17.
He was also the crucial difference in the second test.
Again, Clarke comes up to take Leneen's pass, and he's over for a brilliant match-winning try.
I don't care what's in front of me from now on. There's nothing going to stop me, and I took off and dived. 1961, of course, France were touring New Zealand. We'd won the first test fairly well. Was a day I'll never forget.
What a win. A near cyclone hits New Zealand on the day of the second test, and at Wellington's Athletic Park, the crowds are buffeted and rocked by the savage southerly.
In fact, it was 140 kilometres per hour. But Clarke would still kick points.
Conditions are so bleak at half-time that international rules are waived and the teams leave the field. Macquarie puts it in for France. They hook. Back to Lacaze for a clearing kick, but Tremaine charges it down. He scored. New Zealand had drawn level, 3-all.
And I lined the ball up directly opposite the corner flag.
Clarke kicks, and it's over.
To judge a win like that, the kick itself was an absolute fluke.
The final score, the boot had done it again.
I think Don Clarke was a very good fullback. A lot of people were critical of him because they said he was, you know, big and that sort of thing and lumbering, but Don Clarke wasn't big and lumbering at all. I reckon that he had very good coordination and very good balance.
They were crowd idols, #1 players in the #1 jersey. But the better the player, the greater the pressure.
minutes of play left, and New Zealand are awarded a penalty near the halfway line.
The third test in South Africa, 1960. Yet again, Don Clarke is called on to save New Zealand from defeat.
And the score, 11-6. The tension increases as there is but 1 minute.
The bigger the occasion, the better Clarke performed.
And here comes the equaliser. A bad pass from Briscoe to Nesbitt, who misses. Lideen gathers and sends Laidlaw through the gap. He gives a short kick, and McMullen and Hopwood race for the line. McMullen dives over. The score is now 11-9, and everything depends upon the last deciding conversion. Don Clarke takes it. It's over, and there is the final whistle. South Africa have to be satisfied with a draw.
But the pressures weren't just on the field.
As I can recall on some of the tours I've been on, how players have been very affected by being away from home. They've broken down as men, they've cried, they've wept.
Scott included. Like Clarke, he can recall winning kicks, like this one. But touring South Africa, it had been a different story. After a series whitewash, he was in despair.
Oh, you're referring to the fact that I broke down and cried? Yeah, well, I am a pretty emotional person. I mightn't appear so, and, you know, obviously out in the paddock, lots of people said I turned a little bit nasty when things were sort of going the wrong way, as you might say. But in the 4 tests, I was probably the vital link in whether we did win or did lose. And I just, you know, when I walked in and sat down, all the guys, I just broke and said I was sorry, you know, that it happened that way.
But what did they do?
Oh, well, I don't know. I'm sort of not really that happy talking about it now, but, they just sung for "He's a jolly good fellow," which I thought was a tremendous compliment.
And Don Clarke also had his kicking lapses, notably on the 63-64 tour of the British Isles when suffering a groin injury.
Halfway, Don Clarke, the menace to Wales. A penalty from the second line out from 60 yards out on his left-hand touch gives New Zealand's renowned kicker a chance to frighten Wales. High and strong, but it hits the upright.
The injury robbed him of the chance to emulate George Napier and play every match of the tour.
Again it hits the post, and Wales cleared a touch.
If missed kicks were disappointing, so were the tactics used to beat his fantastic kicking prowess.
Opposition used to soak a rugby ball in water overnight, so it'd make the leather very, very heavy. But they used to come out with half-flat balls, different sized balls, you know, I could go on and on and on. In one particular game, I had my boots pinched.
Nowadays, Clarke's restricted to the sidelines. He still feels the effects of an injury he suffered in his first big match. That was in '51 when he helped Waikato lift the Ranfurly Shield off North Auckland as a 17-year-old. It was an injury he suffered in a late tackle, something he endured throughout his career.
Well, I suffer today. I've got very bad osteoarthritis, and I do suffer, yes.
It's one reason he lives in the warmer climes of South Africa, close to Johannesburg, where he runs a successful tree-felling business. He's been there since 1977. Still considers himself a Kiwi, but has no intention of returning permanently, even if Kiora, at the entrance to his home, indicates where the heart is.
Well, it's something that my wife and I discussed for a long time. And I've always loved South Africa ever since I first toured here in 1960. What people see overseas on television, what they read in the press, and what they hear on the radio is around about 90% total rubbish.
Bob Scott was well into his 60s when he played for a team of ex-All Blacks in a Golden Oldies tournament, sometimes forgetting that he wasn't 40 years younger.
Oh, yeah, I don't know where you got that from at all, but I really did. Oh, I finished up with this bloke coming towards me, and I'm sort of saying to him, well, pass it, but I couldn't stop myself. Oh, honestly, I stopped him okay, and got up as, you know, as though there was nothing wrong, but I obviously, I didn't feel too good, really. But I couldn't help myself. It was just instinct to crash and make sure he wasn't going anywhere.
And, incredibly, Scott showed he can still kick without his boot on. Scott's All Black captain was Fred Allen.
Scott had some built-in genius in him that he could fool people. He seemed to mesmerise them. They could be coming to him and he'd be taking a ball on the ground, Next minute he'd beaten 2 or 3 of them when they were over his shoulder.
And another All Black captain, Golden Oldie Wilson Winneray, remembers Clarke's dominance in his teams.
He was such a treasure in the New Zealand armoury, given the rules of the game that applied at the time. Had he not been there, people might have been looking for other ways of playing the game, but he was a gigantic figure.
Bob Scott never kept any of the memorabilia that a lot of All Blacks do, jerseys and footballs, so on. Bob, why not?
I don't really know. I just probably wasn't that interested in that type of a thing. I was really more interested in, well, winning the game and, well, certainly performing myself. I think that was my basic attitude every time I played. Winning was the important object.
He has scrapbooks, a labour of love by his wife Irene, who he met on the Kiwis tour of Britain immediately after the war. But one scrapbook is missing, the cuttings from that famous tour of 45 years ago.
I'd certainly love to have it back, and if it's out there somewhere, I'd certainly like someone to send it back to me.
Don Clarke also wants something restored.
My only wish is before I die, I then can see South Africa back in sport, which they richly and so deservedly require. And I sincerely hope that I see that before I leave this world to go somewhere else.
So who takes the prize as the greatest fullback? Post-war contenders Clarke and Scott. Pre-war, Napier and Wallace. The debate still continues, even though years ago, Napier and Clarke agreed that Scott wasn't just great Scott, he was the greatest. So Clarke and Napier are in agreement, but rugby fans will keep the argument alive.